Oh, hi there. So, my name's Andy, and here with mate Tiny, super dwarf reticulated python. I call him Tiny because, it's easier for you to pronounce, but in fact, I'm Polish, and the real name that I gave him is Tinio. So, Tinio it is a 16 months old reticulated python. Both of his parents were Madu, and that's his size basically. He's a 79% super dwarf. You can see how slender this animal is and how small this animal is after 16 months after hatching. And one topic I want to talk to you about is feeding of super dwarf retics. Now, one thing that really bothered me at the beginning was that it's such a complicated topic, right? To feed a super dwarf retic, because they're smaller, right? Their metabolism is smaller, is slower. Where they come from, they have not really an abundant source of food. Therefore, their genetics sort of force them to become a bit smaller. And that's quite interesting because normally animals that live on islands, especially reptiles, they typically get larger than the mainland ones. But the evolution went different for super dwarf retics, and they remain small. And in fact, which can be quite confusing, especially among the mainland people or even the ball python keepers, is how to choose its prey based on the current state of the snake. And that was really an issue initially to me, because the way that you should feed a super dwarf retic is nowhere similar to, let me pause, to the species or to snakes that I've just discussed about, because they have a much slower metabolism. They have a much slower metabolism than those two. And if you read on different groups that, for example, you should feed them with 15% of their current weight or 20% of their current weight, that's probably not the good way to feed a super dwarf retic, because that would pretty much mean an obese snake after a couple of months, right? What this animal was eating at the start was small mice. When it was 3 months old, it would eat a 15-gram mice. Then I would transition it to, and it would eat every week. And it was really to get them started on food. And then I would feed them a 25-gram mice every 10 to 12 days after 3 months for about 6 months. And I could see that the animal was gradually getting larger and larger, slowly, steadily. That girth over here would be nice and slender, but without any bones poking through the skin, without spine being too visible. You do not want to starve your retic. But I was kind of shocked that this animal would just eat so little and still be in such a good shape and still grow and put on that weight. So currently that animal is around 700 grams, and after 9 months of keeping him, I switched him to small rats between 35 and 45 grams, to be honest, or maybe 50. And that's the diet that I'm still keeping on. In fact, 6 months ago, I ordered some 60 to 80 gram rats, and they're still in my stock, but I didn't really have an opportunity to feed him these rodents, because I still do think that what I give him is just completely fine every 10 or 12 or even 14 days. The animal is just growing fantastic on these rats. And it is not really a maintenance feeding, because it's really growing. It's really put up on growth recently. So perhaps in the next 2 months I'm going to switch him to a larger prey. But there are some factors that you need to consider what is your case? Because this is a 79% male, which means that this animal is not going to grow large. It's probably going to maybe reach 2.5 meters, maybe less, maybe more, but perhaps less, perhaps around 2. And you know and you realize that the super dwarf is a very broad term. It's a business term that may not determine how large this animal gets, because if you take a super dwarf male, even if it's a 100% super dwarf male, and breed it to a male and female, then this animal, the baby's gonna be big, they're gonna grow big, they're gonna reach a much larger size when they're adult, and that changes the size of the prey that you give them. So the golden rule of thumb is to feed them a meal that is the size of their girth at the broadest point, to be honest. So this is the golden rule, and this is what I kind of stick to. So that's how I judge that this animal is still not ready for a very large meal. Obviously it could eat it. And his sister actually eats, I know that his sister eats much larger prey. And his sister is already much girthier, larger, and also demands slightly more food than him. And there's a discussion that we have. You know, you might put a comment down below what you guys think. How is the growth of a super dwarf retic determined? Because you know, they have all the reptiles have indeterminate growth, but you know, the super dwarf retics, they slow down much faster than their mainland counterparts. So they just start up very quickly, and they slow down much faster than a mainland reticulated python would. Let me just grab him. And the question that we have, that me and some of my friends who keep these guys have, is does the frequency and the load of food that you provide him as it's young influences its final size and weight? Or maybe they're all reach the same size and length, but the animals which are fed less, they do it slower, and the animals that are fed a bit more, they do it faster. So that's the question. So as a molecular biologist, as a person who did a lot of, you know, genetics, I think that there's kind of both, you know, feeding frequency and genetics, they in theory can play a factor, because okay, the genetics gives you the maximum you know, like biological capability of a snake to reach potential size. So the genetics is a potential, but then you also have a regulation of expression of genes, right? And this is achieved by environmental factors. And one of the environmental factors is the food and caloric uptake that the animal has. So perhaps, and I'm only say perhaps, and you guys, you can either correct me or, you know, provide some your information or your observations. Perhaps when you do not push this animal to its genetic limit, it will remain a bit smaller when it's grown up. So these are my thoughts on feeding. And also there's just one more factor that you should consider when feeding super dwarf retics. Like, I honestly think I should give him a bit, maybe not a bit more, because I already feed him quite frequently, to be honest. I mean, his sisters eat about a mouse or like 2 mice every second week, but this guy, he's fed roughly every 10 days. But there's one difference, that how I keep this guy, because I keep him in a very large, to be honest, enclosure, and this animal basically, to climb up, to heat up, it needs to elevate around 40 or 50% of its body to move between branches. So if you saw the enclosure in some other movies, you can see that it's pretty spacey. There is a lot of space for the animal to explore, and what I can see is that this animal, Tiny, he's basically using all that space. He very often, you know, when he is hungry or exploring or just wants to heat up, I mean, he climbs, and he does it a lot. He's very active. So despite digging, he also climbs. And what I think it's this plays a factor why this animal is kept is maintaining such a good muscle tone. This animal is strong, and it has this good muscle tone. And I think that there is a factor to consider how what are the conditions that you keep your snake in. Because I gave him much space, and the animal has space to exercise. Therefore, it potentially burns more calories compared to a situation when, for example, you would keep your animal in a smaller tub or a rack system. Then maybe we should try to consider a smaller prey item or something like that. Like, in a way, Super Dwarf Retics, they remind me a lot like hybrids between snakes, because we know that there is a mainland blood influence, and we know that the mainland Retic is the same species officially, right? And this is just like some sort of like a subspecies of a reticulated python, or maybe like a local type of a reticulated python. But in fact, I believe we should consider them a little bit like hybrids, because they're so physiologically and maybe not really physiologically, but they're so distinct in the way that they hunt, that they eat, that they survive from the mainland retics, is that we really should take that into account. And really, the feeding schedule and the food item size should really be, you know, chosen for each and every animal, depending on its bloodline, depending on its parents' size, depending on its current size, depending on how much percentage it is, how fast it grows, how much movement it has, etc., etc. So it really brings me to an end by saying that what you need to pay attention to is the size and the girth of your snake. If at any point it gets a bit too pudgy, and you can see some signs of that when, you know, the tail gets a bit bigger, and, you know, it's losing its neck definition, as Garrett would say. Like, this means that your animal is getting a bit too obese, a bit too pudgy, and it's not a good thing really for a retic, because they need to be strong and slender. They're athletic, they're inquisitive, and we want to keep them in such a happy, good way. If, however, you see some, you know, bones poking out, you know, your animal is clearly wrinkled, etc., etc., it means that you probably should slightly increase either the food item or the try to increase the food item without really playing maybe too much around the schedule. I think that every 10 days for a year-old Super Dwarf Retic is just fine, and that's basically it. So if you have your own observations regarding Super Dwarf feeding and how they do, please leave a comment. And just before I finish, there's just one observation that I have. Is as Super Dwarf Retics, they really remind me a lot of boa constrictors, because with boa you tend to feed them much less. They still gain that mass, that body weight, but you tend to feed them slightly less than other pythons, just because of their metabolism. And one thing I'm kind of curious about, whether, you know, the evolution of Super Dwarf Retics by chance didn't push their metabolism to slow down a bit compared to the mainland counterparts, and therefore, you know, it would make sense that they need less over time, and that they do not need such a high calorie intake as the mainland retics. So that's basically it. So, and that's Tiny. Hopefully we're gonna have some even more movies of this guy. He's really sweet, and see you next time.